Welcome back to Review and Facts, and today we are diving deep into one of the most influential urban crime dramas ever put on screen, a film that not only launched several major careers but also captured the raw pulse of early 90s Harlem with a rare and unflinching honesty. We are talking about Juice, the 1992 American crime thriller that remains a defining piece of hip-hop cinema more than 3 decades after its release. Before we get into the story itself, let's set the stage properly, because understanding where this film comes from and who made it tells you everything about why it hit as hard as it did. Juice was directed by Ernest R. Dickerson, and this was actually his feature-length directorial debut. Before stepping behind the camera as a director, Dickerson had built a formidable reputation as a cinematographer, working closely with Spike Lee on some of that era's most celebrated films, and that visual sensibility carries through every frame of Juice. The screenplay was written by Dickerson himself alongside Gerard Brown, and together they crafted a story rooted firmly in the streets of Harlem, New York City, where the film was also shot in 1991. The production companies behind the film were Island World and Mauritanian, with the movie distributed by Paramount Pictures. It was made on a modest budget of around $5 million, and it went on to gross a little over $20 million at the box office, a genuinely strong return that proved there was a real audience hungry for stories like this one. Juice was officially released in theaters on January 17, 1992. And while its box office numbers were solid, its cultural impact would go on to dwarf its financial performance many times over in the years that followed. Now let's talk about the overview, because Juice is not simply a crime film in the traditional sense. It is a coming-of-age story wrapped inside a tragedy, one that follows 4 young black friends growing up together in Harlem as they navigate school, family pressures, police harassment, rival street gangs, and the everyday temptations of a neighborhood that offers very few easy paths forward. The film's title itself refers to a specific kind of currency that exists on the street, not money but respect, power, and reputation. Having juice means people fear you, people know your name, and people do not mess with you. That single concept becomes the emotional and thematic engine that drives the entire film, because each of these 4 young men wants juice in his own way. And the tragedy of the story is watching how that desire slowly tears their friendship apart and leads them toward violence none of them can fully control once it begins. Moving into the plot itself, the story centers on 4 teenage friends living in Harlem: Roland Bishop, Quincy known as Q, Raheem Porter, and Eric known as Steele. These 4 have grown up together, and much of the early portion of the film simply lives inside their day-to-day world, skipping school, hanging out at Steele's apartment, spending time at the neighborhood arcade, and visiting a local record store where they occasionally steal vinyl records to feed Q's growing passion for DJing. Q is the dreamer of the group, someone who genuinely wants to escape the cycle of street life through music, and he has an opportunity to prove himself in an upcoming DJ competition, a subplot that runs parallel to the darker turn the story eventually takes. The 4 friends are constantly harassed by local police, and they also find themselves in ongoing tension with a rival Puerto Rican gang led by a character named Radames, which adds another layer of danger to their daily existence. The turning point of the film comes when Bishop, increasingly obsessed with gaining respect and power, convinces the group to commit a robbery at a local convenience store. What begins as a seemingly straightforward petty crime spirals catastrophically out of control. During the robbery, Bishop shoots and kills the store owner, an act of violence that immediately shatters the group's dynamic. From this point forward, Bishop becomes increasingly unstable and paranoid, convinced that his own friends might turn on him or expose what happened, and he begins to systematically turn against the very people he grew up with. The remainder of the film follows the disintegration of this once tight-knit friendship as Bishop's hunger for power curdles into something genuinely dangerous, while Q, Raheem, and Steele are forced to reckon with the reality that the person they trusted most has become the greatest threat to their survival. The story builds toward a tense and tragic climax that forces Q in particular to confront exactly what kind of man he wants to become, and whether chasing Juice is truly worth the cost that Bishop has already paid. Let's move into the cast, because this is where Juice becomes even more remarkable in hindsight. Omar Epps plays Quincy, known as Q, the aspiring DJ and emotional center of the film, and this role marked his very first acting performance in a feature film, launching a career that would go on to include major television and film work for decades afterward. Tupac Shakur plays Roland Bishop, and this performance is widely regarded as one of the most significant screen debuts in hip-hop cinema history. Shakur had never acted in a film before this, yet he delivers a performance so magnetic and unsettling that it instantly established him as a genuine screen talent, separate entirely from his identity as a musician. His portrayal of Bishop's descent into paranoia and violence is often cited as the emotional core that makes the entire film work. Khalil Kain plays Raheem Porter, and Jermaine Hopkins, often credited as Huggy, plays Steele, rounding out the core friend group with performances that ground the film's emotional stakes. Beyond the four leads, Juice also features an early and notable appearance from Samuel L. Jackson in a supporting role, along with a memorable cameo from Queen Latifah. The supporting cast is filled with figures connected to the hip-hop world of that era, including cameo appearances from artists like Treach, EPMD, Special Ed, Fab Five Freddy, and Ed Lover, which further cemented the film's authentic connection to the culture it was portraying. This blending of professional actors with real figures from the hip-hop community gave Juice a texture and authenticity that was fairly rare for films of its kind at the time. As for release details, Juice hit theaters on January 17, 1992, distributed by Paramount Pictures, with a runtime of roughly 95 to 96 minutes depending on the source. The film's soundtrack, produced with involvement from Hank Shocklee and the Bomb Squad, became almost as culturally significant as the movie itself, further embedding Juice within the broader hip-hop movement of the early 90s. Over the years, the film has received multiple anniversary releases, including a 25th anniversary Blu-ray edition with bonus content such as director commentary and retrospective interviews, as well as a 30th anniversary restoration from Paramount, a clear sign of just how enduring its legacy has remained. What makes Juice so important, even decades later, is the way it captures a very specific time and place with total honesty, refusing to soften or glamorize the consequences of the choices its characters make. It stands alongside other defining urban dramas of its era, yet it carves out its own identity through Tupac Shakur's unforgettable debut performance, and its unflinching exploration of what happens when the pursuit of respect turns into something far more destructive. For anyone interested in the roots of hip-hop cinema, or simply looking for a film that captures the raw energy of early 90s New York, Juice remains essential viewing. Welcome back to Review and Facts. In our last video we gave you the full overview of Juice, the 1992 crime drama that introduced the world to Tupac Shakur as an actor and cemented itself as one of the defining films of hip-hop cinema. Today we are going even deeper. This is the complete story retelling of Juice, told from beginning to end, scene by scene, so you can experience the full emotional weight of this film even if you have never seen it, or so you can relive it if you have. Settle in, because this is a long and heavy story, and every part of it matters. The film opens on the streets of Harlem in the early morning hours, and immediately the camera moves through the neighborhood like it belongs there, gliding past brownstones, corner stores, and sidewalks that are just beginning to stir with life. This is not a Harlem scene from the outside looking in. This is a Harlem shown from the inside, lived in and familiar, shot with the eye of someone who understands the rhythms of the block, the way people greet each other, the way music spills out of open windows, the way danger and community exist side by side without ever fully separating from one another. Before we meet our main characters, we are introduced to four friends who have known each other since childhood. There is Quincy, who everyone calls Q, a quiet and thoughtful young man whose real passion in life is music, specifically the art of DJing. Q dreams of something bigger than the block, and unlike his friends, he has an actual outlet for his ambition, a real path he can see in front of him if he works hard enough and gets the right opportunity. Then there is Roland Bishop, known simply as Bishop, intense, sharp-tongued, and carrying himself with a restless energy that makes him magnetic but also unpredictable. Bishop is the friend who always pushes things a little further than anyone else is comfortable with, the one who dares the others into trouble because some part of him is always hungry for more than what their daily lives offer him. There is Raheem Porter, older than the other three in spirit if not always in years, someone who is beginning to feel the pull of adult responsibility because his girlfriend is pregnant, which puts him in a very different headspace than his friends, caught between the freedom of being a teenager and the weight of impending fatherhood. And finally there is Eric, known as Steele, the biggest of the group physically, an easygoing presence who tends to go along with whatever the others decide, someone who craves belonging above all. The film wastes no time establishing that these four are inseparable, but it also wastes no time showing us the daily obstacles that define their lives. The very first real sequence we see is Q waking up late for school, rushing through his cramped apartment, while his mother yells after him, and the audience immediately understands that school is not something Q particularly values, not because he is not intelligent, but because school as an institution has very little to offer someone who already knows what he wants to do with his life. He grabs his records, a symbol that will follow him through the entire film, because for Q, music is not a hobby, it is closer to a calling. Before Q even reaches his friends, the film pauses to show us small, telling details of the neighborhood itself, older men gathered outside a barbershop trading stories, a group of younger kids playing stickball in the street, a woman sweeping her stoop while keeping half an eye on everyone passing by. These small human textures matter, because they establish Harlem not as a backdrop of danger and despair but as a genuine community, full of ordinary rhythms and relationships, and that grounding becomes essential to understanding why the violence that eventually erupts feels less like an inevitability of the setting. And Q meets up with Bishop, Raheem, and Steele, and together they decide, as they seem to decide most mornings, that school simply is not worth attending today. Instead they head out into the city, and this is where the film gives us one of its most important early sequences, a long stretch of the four friends simply existing together, walking through Harlem, cracking jokes, ribbing each other, showing the kind of easy affection that only exists between people who have known each other their entire lives. They stop at a local arcade, spending time and money they do not really have on video games, engaging in playful trash talk and competition that reveals a lot about each of their personalities. Bishop is combative even in play, always needing to win, always pushing the stakes higher than they need to be. Q is more relaxed, content to enjoy the moment without needing to dominate it. Raheem hangs back a bit, distracted, his mind clearly elsewhere given the responsibility waiting for him at home. Steele just wants everyone to be having a good time together, uncomfortable with any tension that threatens the group's unity. From the arcade, the four friends make their way to a record store, and this sequence is crucial because it plants seeds that will matter enormously later in the film. Q is there ostensibly to browse, but the group's habit of pocketing records without paying for them is revealed here. A small crime that the film frames almost casually, the kind of low-stakes mischief that feels harmless in the moment, but establishes an important truth about these characters. They are used to taking small risks together, used to bending rules without seeing themselves as truly criminal, used to treating minor lawbreaking as a kind of shared bonding ritual rather than something with real consequences. This detail matters because it shows us the incremental nature of how the story will eventually spiral, because the film is fundamentally interested in how small transgressions can normalize larger and larger ones until suddenly you are standing somewhere you never intended to be. Inside the record store itself, the film takes a moment to let Q's passion breathe, showing him flipping through crates with genuine focus, discussing specific tracks and beats with the store's owner, a rare adult figure in the film who treats Q with real respect rather than suspicion, someone who recognizes the seriousness underneath Q's otherwise laid-back exterior. It is a small relationship, barely more than a handful of lines, but it plants an important idea early in the film, the notion that Q is. While at the record store, tension surfaces between the group and a rival crew, a Puerto Rican gang led by a young man named Radames. The confrontation is not physically violent in this moment, but the hostility is palpable, filled with posturing, insults, and the unmistakable sense that these two groups occupy the same territory and neither is willing to yield ground. This rivalry is not the central conflict of the film, but it functions as a constant undercurrent of danger running beneath the surface of the story, a reminder that violence in this world does not need a dramatic catalyst. It can erupt from something as small as a shared sidewalk or a look held a beat too long. The film uses this rivalry sparingly but effectively throughout its runtime, periodically reminding us that Bishop, Q, Raheem, and Steele already live inside a world where physical danger is always one wrong word away. The film also introduces us briefly to a slightly older figure in the neighborhood, a man who runs a local radio program and occasionally lets Q come by to watch him work, offering the kind of mentorship that Q clearly craves and rarely receives elsewhere. These scenes are brief but meaningful, giving weight to the idea that Q's ambitions are not naive fantasy but something rooted in real access, real possibility, and real people who believe in what he might become if he can stay focused and stay out of trouble long enough to get there. It is against this backdrop of genuine, hard-won opportunity that Bishop's escalating recklessness becomes even more tragic, because we understand exactly how much there is to lose, not in the abstract, but in very concrete terms tied directly to Q's future. As the day continues, we get a clearer picture of each character's home life. And this is where the film's emotional foundation really takes shape. Q's mother worries about him constantly, frustrated by his lack of interest in school, but there is real love in that frustration, and we understand that Q, whatever his faults, comes from a home where someone is actively trying to steer him towards something better. Bishop's home situation is markedly different, and considerably more difficult. He lives with his father, a man dealing with his own hardships, a World War II veteran whose mental state has deteriorated over the years, and the relationship between Bishop and his father is strained, cold, and largely devoid of the warmth we see in Q's household. This detail is not incidental. The film is quietly building an argument about where Bishop's hunger for respect and power actually originates, suggesting that a young man who feels unseen and unvalued at home will often go looking for validation somewhere else, and that somewhere else, in this story, becomes an increasingly dangerous path. Before the story moves into its darker territory, the film takes time to deepen our understanding of Q's world outside the group, particularly his connection to a young woman named Yolanda, who works at a local hair salon and shares a warm, easy chemistry with him. Their scenes together offer a brief window into a version of Q's life untouched by the pressures building around Bishop, a glimpse of ordinary teenage romance, flirtation, and the simple pleasure of connecting with someone who sees him for who he actually is rather than for what he might become useful for. This relationship matters narratively because it gives Q something tangible to protect, another reason beyond the DJ competition to want a future that exists outside the reach of violence. And it makes everything that follows hit that much harder, because we understand exactly how much Q stands to lose. The film also spends meaningful time establishing the tension inside Bishop's home more fully. His father, a veteran whose experiences in the war left him with deep and largely untreated psychological wounds, drifts through their apartment as a distant, unstable presence, someone who is physically there but emotionally unreachable. Bishop tries, in his own limited way, to connect with him, but is consistently met with silence, confusion, or outright hostility. There is a quiet devastation in watching Bishop attempt small gestures of care toward his father, only to be rebuffed again and again, and the film uses these moments sparingly but pointedly, making it clear that Bishop has spent his entire life starving for a kind of validation and stability that simply does not exist for him at home. It is not offered as an excuse for what Bishop eventually does, but it is offered as an explanation, a way of understanding how a young man arrives at the belief that fear and power might be the only kinds of respect actually available. The narrative introduces its central symbolic device explicitly during this stretch of the film, as the four friends talk about the concept of juice. Juice, in the language of their world, does not mean money and does not mean material wealth. Juice means respect. It means power. It means being someone whose name carries weight on the street, someone other people fear or admire, someone who cannot be pushed around or overlooked. Each of the four friends wants juice in some form, but crucially, they each define it differently, and that difference in definition becomes the emotional fault line that eventually cracks their friendship apart. For Q, juice increasingly starts to mean recognition through his music, through skill, through building something real that other people respect because it deserves respect. For Bishop, juice starts to mean something much more immediate and much more dangerous, respect earned through fear, through the willingness to do what other people are too afraid to do. Steele's home life, though given less screen time than the others, is sketched with quiet empathy as well. He lives in a household that is loving but stretched thin, and much of his identity within the friend group seems tied to being the dependable one, the peacemaker, the friend everyone can count on to defuse tension with a joke or a shrug. This role becomes increasingly difficult for him to maintain as the story progresses, because there is no joke large enough to defuse what eventually happens between his friends, and watching Steele's easy humor curdle into visible anxiety over the course of the film is one of its quieter but no less effective character arcs. A significant subplot begins to develop around this point in the story, centered on an upcoming DJ competition that Q desperately wants to enter. This competition represents everything Q has been working toward, a legitimate opportunity to prove his skill on a stage that could open real doors for him. The film uses this subplot brilliantly, because it gives Q an alternate path forward, a genuine escape route from the trajectory the other characters seem locked into, and it raises the emotional stakes of everything that follows, because every choice Q makes from this point on either pulls him closer to that stage or drags him further away from it. His friends know how much this competition means to him. Bishop especially seems to both support Q's dream and, in more troubling moments, resent it slightly, as if some part of him understands that Q has an exit that Bishop himself does not. The film gives real attention to the mechanics of Q's musical ambition during this stretch, showing him practicing at home for hours, blending records together, refining transitions, chasing a sound that he believes can set him apart from every other DJ in the neighborhood competing for the same spotlight. These scenes are filmed with a kind of reverence that the rest of the film reserves for very little else, lingering on Q's hands working the turntables, his face locked in focused concentration, and the effect is to establish music as the one space in his life that feels entirely his own, untouched by the chaos, danger, and pressure surrounding him everywhere else. His friends occasionally stop by to listen, and these small scenes of camaraderie, Bishop nodding along, Steele trying and failing to freestyle over the beat, Raheem cracking jokes about Q's seriousness, are some of the warmest and most human moments in the entire film, made all the more poignant in hindsight by everything that is about to unravel between them. We also get a fuller picture of Raheem's home life during this period, watching him and his girlfriend navigate the early, uncertain stages of an unplanned pregnancy. There is tenderness in these scenes, a genuine sweetness in the way Raheem talks about wanting to do right by his child, wanting to be present in a way that perhaps the adults in his own life were not always able to be for him. But there is also visible anxiety, the practical fear of how a teenager with no stable income and no clear path forward is supposed to provide for a family. This subplot grounds Raheem as the most forward-looking member of the group, the one already being pulled toward adult responsibility whether he is ready for it or not, and it is precisely this responsibility that makes his later reluctance to participate in Bishop's escalating recklessness feel so understandable, and so human. The four friends continue drifting through their days in a pattern that feels almost hypnotic in its repetition, skipping school, hanging out, dodging police who seem to view them with automatic suspicion regardless of what they are actually doing. The film includes several charged encounters with law enforcement during this stretch, officers stopping the group, questioning them, treating them with a hostility that has nothing to do with any specific crime and everything to do with assumption. These scenes are uncomfortable by design, and they serve an important narrative purpose beyond simple realism. They establish the constant, low-grade pressure these young men live under, a pressure that never fully disappears, that shapes how they move through their own neighborhood, and that makes the idea of being feared rather than harassed increasingly appealing to someone like Bishop, who is tired of being treated as a suspect without ever having the power that suspicion implies. Around this same time, the rivalry with Radames and his crew flares up again, this time escalating into something closer to real physical danger, with a tense confrontation on the street that leaves the four friends shaken and acutely aware of just how exposed they are in their own neighborhood. This encounter functions as a kind of pressure valve moment for the film, reinforcing just how constant the threat of violence already is in these characters' lives even before Bishop introduces a weapon into the equation. It also plants a seed of humiliation in Bishop specifically, who walks away from the confrontation feeling that he was made to look weak in front of his friends, a feeling that will directly inform the choices he makes only a short time later. The turning point of the entire film arrives when Bishop, during one of the group's aimless wanderings, gets his hands on a handgun. The moment he acquires the weapon is treated with real weight by the film, a shift in tone that the audience feels immediately even before the characters themselves fully register what has changed. Bishop's demeanor transforms almost instantly. Where before he was combative and restless in a mostly harmless way, now there is a new confidence in him, a swagger that was not there before, and it becomes clear very quickly that possessing this weapon has awakened something in Bishop that had been simmering under the surface all along. He begins carrying himself differently, speaking differently, treating minor conflicts with a boldness that unsettles even his closest friends. Raheem in particular grows uneasy, sensing that something in Bishop has shifted in a way that cannot easily be undone. It is around this point that Bishop begins pushing the group towards something far more serious than skipping school or lifting records from a shop. He proposes robbing a local convenience store, framing it initially almost as a joke, then gradually, insistently, as something they should actually do. The film handles this escalation with real patience, refusing to rush the moment, allowing the tension to build naturally as Bishop wears down his friend's resistance piece by piece. Q is hesitant, worried about jeopardizing everything he has been building toward with his music and his upcoming competition. Raheem is deeply reluctant, acutely aware that he has a child on the way and cannot afford to take unnecessary risks. Steele, as always, is uncertain but ultimately swayed by the group's momentum, unwilling to be the one who breaks apart their unity by refusing to go along. In the scenes leading up to this decision, the film takes care to show each friend wrestling privately with the idea before the group ever discusses it openly. Q lies awake turning the proposal over in his mind, weighing the very real risk against his loyalty to Bishop and his own frustration at always being treated as an easy target by people like Radames and the police who patrol their block. Steele, in a quieter, more introspective moment than we typically see from him, admits to Q that he is scared, but that he is more scared of being the one who says no and gets left behind by the group. Raheem, for his part, tries repeatedly to talk Bishop down, reminding him of everything they all stand to lose, appealing to the version of Bishop he grew up with rather than the version standing in front of him now. But Bishop's mind is already made up, and every attempt to reason with him only seems to harden his resolve further. Bishop's argument, delivered with increasing intensity, centers entirely on the idea of juice. He tells his friends that they deserve more than what they have, that they are tired of being disrespected, tired of being treated as nothing by everyone around them, and that this robbery is not just about the money sitting in that register, it is about proving to themselves and to the world that they are not to be underestimated. It is a seductive argument precisely because it is built on real and legitimate frustrations, the kind of frustration that comes from feeling unseen and powerless. And the tragedy of the film lies in watching how easily that legitimate frustration gets channeled into something that will ultimately destroy everything these four friends have built together. The film stages a pivotal late-night scene in which the group gathers on a rooftop overlooking the neighborhood, a setting the film returns to more than once as a kind of sanctuary above the chaos of the streets below. Up there, removed from the immediate pressures of school, police, and rival gangs, the four friends have historically been able to speak more honestly with one another, and this scene is no exception, except now the honesty on display is far more fraught than anything we have seen from them before. Bishop lays out his plan for the robbery in full, no longer joking, no longer testing the waters, and the silence that follows from his friends says as much as any dialogue could. The camera holds on each of their faces in turn, capturing the exact moment each young man internally crosses the line from resistance to reluctant agreement, a moment the film treats with the gravity it deserves. Eventually, worn down by Bishop's persistence and by their own complicated desires for the kind of respect and power that Bishop is promising, the group agrees to go through with the robbery. The film builds toward this moment with mounting dread, each scene tightening the tension a little further, small character beats reminding the audience of exactly what each of these young men stands to lose. We see Q handling his records, thinking about the competition ahead. We see Raheem with his girlfriend, gently placing his hand on her stomach, imagining the life waiting for him if he can just make it through this one reckless decision without consequence. We see Steele simply trying to keep the peace within the group, sensing that something irreversible is approaching but unable to find the words to stop it. On the day the robbery is finally set to happen, the film slows down deliberately, stretching out the hours leading up to it with an almost unbearable patience. We watch Q go through the motions of an ordinary afternoon, visiting Yolanda at the salon, the two of them talking about nothing in particular, and the scene is shot with such warmth and normalcy that it becomes quietly devastating in retrospect, a final glimpse of the life Q might have had if the events of that night unfold differently. We watch Raheem sit with his girlfriend, gently resting his hand against her stomach, talking softly about names, about the future, about the kind of father he wants to be, entirely unaware that he is running out of time to become that father at all. These scenes are not filler. They are the film reminding us, one last time, exactly what is at stake before it takes everything away. The night of the robbery arrives, and the film shifts into an entirely different register, tighter, more claustrophobic, the camera work becoming more urgent as the four friends approach the convenience store they have targeted. Inside, the atmosphere is thick with anxiety. This is not a group of hardened criminals executing a plan with confidence. These are four young men who have never done anything like this before, and every gesture betrays that inexperience, the trembling hands, the shaky voices, the way they keep glancing at each other for reassurance that none of them can actually provide. Bishop, holding the gun, is the only one who seems to have crossed fully into the moment, his energy sharper and more focused than his friends, a contrast that the film uses to devastating effect. Inside the store, the film draws out every excruciating second with real precision, the fluorescent lighting casting a harsh, unglamorous glow over the entire scene, stripping away any sense of cinematic cool that might have romanticized what is about to happen. Bishop's voice, when he finally speaks to the store owner, carries a forced authority that does not quite mask the fear underneath it, and for a brief moment it almost seems as though the robbery might actually go the way Bishop intended, quick, clean, over before anyone has time to think too hard about what they are doing. That brief illusion of control is precisely what makes the moment it shatters so devastating. What follows is the single most consequential sequence in the entire film. As the robbery unfolds, something goes wrong. The store owner resists, or reaches for something, or simply moves in a way that Bishop interprets as a threat, and in a moment of pure, irreversible violence, Bishop shoots and kills him. The gunshot detonates the entire film's tone in an instant. Everything before this moment was build-up, tension, foreshadowing. Everything after this moment is consequence. The four friends flee the scene in chaos, and the sequence that follows, their desperate run through the streets and alleys of Harlem, is shot with a frantic, disorienting energy that puts the audience directly inside their panic. There is no triumph in this moment, no sense of a heist successfully pulled off. There is only horror, the horror of Q, Raheem, and Steele realizing in real time that their friend has just killed a man, and that their lives have been permanently and irrevocably altered. In the chaotic seconds immediately following the gunshot, the film captures a moment of frozen disbelief among the four friends, a stretch of time where nobody moves, nobody speaks, and the enormity of what has just happened has not yet fully registered. It is Bishop himself who breaks the silence, grabbing his stunned friends and forcing them into motion, and there is something chilling in how quickly he transitions from the shock of the act itself into pure survival instinct, as though some switch inside him has already been flipped that will never fully flip back. The friends scatter through back alleys and side streets, ducking behind parked cars, scrambling over fences, the geography of their own neighborhood suddenly transformed from familiar territory into a maze of potential exposure, every window and doorway a possible witness. In the immediate aftermath, the film spends significant time with the psychological fallout among the group. Raheem is furious and terrified in equal measure, unable to comprehend how a robbery that was supposed to prove something about their strength has instead made them murderers. Q is shaken to his core, the reality of what has happened clashing violently against the future he had been imagining for himself just hours earlier. Steele retreats into himself, overwhelmed by guilt and fear. And Bishop, disturbingly, begins to process the killing not as a tragedy but as an initiation, a crossing over into a kind of power he has never possessed before. Where his friends see catastrophe, Bishop begins to see confirmation of everything he believed about strength and respect. He has taken a life, and rather than being destroyed by that fact, some broken part of him feels emboldened by it. This is where the film's true tragedy begins to unfold, because Bishop's transformation from this point forward is rapid and deeply unsettling. He becomes obsessed with control, convinced that his friends, racked with guilt and fear, represent a liability that could expose what happened and destroy him. Rather than leaning on his oldest friends for support during this crisis, Bishop begins to view them as threats. He watches them constantly, testing their loyalty, probing for any sign of weakness that might suggest one of them intends to go to the police or simply crack under the psychological weight of what they have done. The film masterfully tracks Bishop's descent into paranoia, showing us a young man whose sense of identity has become entirely wrapped up in an act of violence he now needs to protect at any cost, even the cost of destroying the very friendships that once defined him. In the days that immediately follow the killing, the film shows the group attempting, with increasing difficulty, to maintain some semblance of normal life. Q forces himself to keep practicing for the DJ competition, though his focus is visibly shattered, his hands hesitating over the turntables in a way they never did before. Steele throws himself into distraction, trying to laugh and joke the way he always has, but there is a hollowness to it now, a performance of normalcy rather than the real thing. Raheem, meanwhile, withdraws almost entirely, spending more time with his girlfriend, as if physical proximity to the family he is building might somehow insulate him from the horror of what he participated in. News of the murder spreads through the neighborhood and eventually reaches the local news, and the film includes a tense sequence of the four friends watching a broadcast about the killing together, each of them reacting in ways that reveal exactly how differently they are processing their guilt, Bishop watching with an unsettling stillness, the others visibly recoiling. The group's dynamic fractures visibly in the days that follow. Raheem, increasingly disturbed by Bishop's behavior and terrified for the safety of his girlfriend and unborn child, begins to distance himself, desperate to find some way to move past what happened and protect his family from the fallout. Q, caught in an agonizing position between loyalty to his oldest friend and his own mounting horror at what Bishop is becoming, tries to hold on to some version of normalcy, still clinging to his dream of competing in the DJ competition, still trying to convince himself that he can somehow keep one foot in his old life while navigating the nightmare Bishop has pulled them into. Steele, perhaps the most emotionally fragile of the group, is caught in the middle, unable to fully break from Bishop out of loyalty and fear, but increasingly disturbed by the person his friend. The film also shows Bishop attempting, in his own distorted way, to maintain some outward appearance of normal teenage life even as his internal world collapses further into paranoia. He shows up to a party the group had planned to attend before everything changed, and the scene is deeply unsettling precisely because of how ordinary it initially appears: music playing, people dancing, everyone pretending for a few hours that nothing has changed. Bishop moves through this party with a menacing confidence that unnerves everyone who crosses his path, and it becomes increasingly clear that he is no longer simply reacting to fear of exposure. He has begun to actively enjoy the power his secret and his weapon afford him over everyone around him, friend and stranger alike. Bishop's paranoia escalates into direct threats against his own friends, a development that the film handles with genuine dramatic weight rather than melodrama. He confronts Raheem in a moment charged with real danger, questioning his loyalty, making it clear that any hesitation, any sign of weakness, will be treated as betrayal. The tension between former best friends becomes almost unbearable to watch, because the film has spent so much time earlier establishing the genuine affection between these characters that seeing it curdle into suspicion and threat carries enormous emotional weight. This is not a story about strangers turning on each other. This is a story about brothers, in every sense but blood, being torn apart by the corrosive effects of guilt, fear, and a hunger for power that has gone catastrophically wrong. Adding further pressure to this already volatile situation, a police detective investigating the convenience store killing begins circling the group, showing up at unexpected moments, asking pointed questions that seem designed less to gather information than to unsettle whoever might be involved. These scenes ratchet up the tension considerably, because they force the audience to watch four visibly guilty young men try to maintain composure under direct scrutiny, knowing that any crack in their performance of innocence could bring the entire situation crashing down. Bishop handles this pressure by becoming even more controlling of his friends' behavior, coaching them, threatening them, making it unmistakably clear that he views their fear not as something to be comforted but as a liability to be managed by whatever means necessary. Matters escalate further when Raheem, unable to bear the pressure and increasingly convinced that Bishop poses a genuine threat to his safety and his family's future, makes a decision that will prove fatal. In a confrontation between the two former friends, one that the film stages with unbearable tension, Bishop, now fully consumed by his need to eliminate any perceived threat to himself, kills Raheem. This second death lands even harder than the first, precisely because it is not a stranger caught in the chaos of a robbery gone wrong. This is Bishop murdering someone he has known his entire life, someone who grew up beside him, someone whose only crime was wanting to protect his family from the storm Bishop himself created. The film does not shy away from the horror of this moment, nor does it allow Bishop any easy justification. This is presented as the point of no return, the moment where any remaining ambiguity about what Bishop has become is stripped away entirely. The film lingers on the immediate aftermath of Raheem's death with real emotional gravity, refusing to rush past it as simply another plot beat. We see the devastation ripple outward, touching Raheem's girlfriend, who now faces the prospect of raising their child entirely alone, and touching Q and Steele, who are left to process not only grief but also the terrifying realization that the person responsible for that grief is someone they still have to face every single day. There is a particularly wrenching scene in which Q, alone, replays memories of Raheem in his mind, the easy laughter of earlier scenes now recontextualized as something achingly out of reach, a friendship that can never be repaired or reclaimed. Q and Steele are left reeling from Raheem's death, forced to confront the unbearable truth that Bishop, their childhood friend, has now killed twice, and that neither of them is safe as long as Bishop believes they might expose him. The film's final act becomes a tense, harrowing cat-and-mouse dynamic, as Bishop, increasingly unhinged, begins actively hunting down the remaining members of his former friend group, convinced that eliminating them entirely is the only way to secure the power and control he now associates with his own survival. Steele, terrified and desperate, becomes a target, and the film stages a harrowing sequence in which Bishop turns his violence directly against the friend who once considered him practically family. Steele's confrontation with Bishop is staged with a raw, frightening intensity, the film making clear just how far Bishop has drifted from the person who once considered Steele one of his closest friends. What should be a conversation between two people who grew up together instead plays out like a hunter cornering prey, Bishop's voice cold and calculating, Steele's desperation and confusion mounting with every passing second as he tries and fails to understand how their friendship arrived at this point. Steele survives this particular encounter, but the psychological damage lingers, and the film uses his shaken, hollowed-out demeanor in its aftermath to underline just how completely Bishop's transformation has poisoned every relationship he once valued. Throughout this unraveling, Q's parallel storyline involving the DJ competition continues to run alongside the horror consuming the rest of the group, and the film uses this juxtaposition deliberately. Q still has a chance, still has a door open to him that Bishop has slammed permanently shut for himself, and the tension of the final act comes from wondering whether Q will be able to survive Bishop's rampage long enough to walk through that door, or whether the violence Bishop has unleashed will consume Q as well before he ever gets the chance. This structural choice is one of the most effective elements of the entire film, because it keeps a flicker of hope alive even as the story grows darker and darker, refusing to let the narrative collapse entirely into despair. Interwoven with these escalating confrontations, the film gives us glimpses of Q attempting to prepare for the DJ competition despite the collapse of everything around him, practicing late into the night with red-rimmed eyes, distracted, exhausted, yet unwilling to let go of the one part of his life that still feels like it belongs entirely to him. There is something quietly heroic in Q's refusal to abandon this dream even as his world crumbles, and the film frames these practice sessions with a kind of fragile hope. The film builds toward its climax with Bishop's obsession reaching its final, most dangerous form. Having already killed the store owner and Raheem, Bishop turns his full attention to Q, whom he now views as the last real threat to his freedom and his twisted sense of power. The confrontation between the two former best friends becomes the emotional and narrative climax of the entire film, staged in a way that forces both characters and the audience to reckon with everything that has led to this point. Bishop is no longer the restless, hungry teenager we met at the start of the film. He has become something closer to a predator, consumed entirely by his need for dominance, willing to destroy the last person who ever truly loved him in order to protect the power he gained through violence. Before the final confrontation, the film gives us one last, quietly devastating scene between Q and Bishop, a moment where the two of them speak almost like the old friends they once were, Bishop attempting to justify everything he has done, searching for some form of understanding or forgiveness from the one person whose opinion he still seems to care about. Q, grieving and terrified in equal measure, refuses to give him that absolution, and it is in this refusal that we see Bishop's last thin connection to his former self finally sever completely. From this point forward, whatever remained of the boy Q grew up with is gone, replaced entirely by someone consumed by the need to protect the power he has built through violence, whatever the cost. The climax plays out across a tense, high-stakes sequence involving pursuit, confrontation, and a desperate physical struggle between Q and Bishop that carries the full emotional weight of everything the film has built toward. This is not simply an action sequence. It is the final collision between two former friends who once shared everything, now reduced to a fight for survival where only one of them can walk away. The film frames this confrontation with genuine tragedy rather than triumph, because even as Q fights for his own life against the friend who has become his greatest threat, There is no sense of victory in what unfolds, only devastation at how completely their friendship and their futures have been destroyed by one impulsive decision and the violence that followed in its wake. The physical struggle between the two former friends takes them through tight stairwells, across rooftops, and finally into a space that echoes, deliberately, the earlier rooftop scenes where the group once sat together as friends with nothing more serious to discuss than music and mischief. Returning to this kind of setting for the final confrontation is no accident, and it underscores the tragedy at the heart of the entire film, that everything which has been lost, the friendship, the trust, the shared future these four young men once imagined together, cannot ever be recovered, no matter how this final struggle resolves. Every blow exchanged between Q and Bishop carries the weight of years of shared history now twisted into violence, and the film refuses to let the audience experience this climax as simple action spectacle, insisting instead on its full emotional cost. In the film's final resolution, Bishop's reign of terror comes to an end, and Q, having survived the ordeal, is left standing amid the wreckage of everything that once defined his world. The story closes not with celebration but with a heavy, sobering quiet, the unmistakable sense that even survival here comes at an enormous cost. Q has lost his closest friends, watched his own hunger for respect nearly consume him the same way it consumed Bishop, and been forced to confront exactly how thin the line can be between wanting to be seen and wanting to be feared. The film's final images linger on this cost rather than offering easy resolution, refusing to let the audience walk away with any sense that what happened here was worth it, no matter what form of respect or power was ultimately gained or lost along the way. The film's closing stretch also makes a point of returning briefly to the wider Harlem community that framed its opening, the barbershop conversations, the kids playing in the street, the everyday rhythms of a neighborhood that will absorb this tragedy the way it has absorbed so many others before it, quietly, without fanfare, life continuing forward even as individual lives are permanently altered. This choice reinforces one of the film's most enduring themes, the idea that the pursuit of respect and power at any cost is not simply a personal failing isolated to Bishop alone, but a pressure that exists everywhere within this. What makes the ending of Juice so powerful, and why the film continues to resonate so strongly decades later, is that it refuses to offer a simple moral lesson wrapped up neatly for the audience. Instead, it leaves us sitting with the full weight of what unchecked ambition, unresolved trauma, and the desperate pursuit of respect can do to people who started out as nothing more than four friends trying to find their place in a world that offered them very few easy paths forward. Bishop's transformation from a restless, wounded teenager into someone capable of destroying everyone he once loved stands as the film's central tragedy, a warning about how the hunger for power, when left unexamined and unaddressed, can hollow out even the deepest bonds of friendship and family. In the quiet moments after the confrontation finally ends, the film allows the neighborhood itself to reassert its presence, the ordinary sounds of Harlem waking up around Q even as his own world lies in ruins, a deliberate reminder that life continues around personal tragedy whether we are ready for it to or not. There is no swelling music here, no sense of catharsis or release, only the sobering image of a young man left standing amid consequences he never fully anticipated when this all began, with four friends simply looking for a way to matter in a world that too often overlooked them. Q's survival, meanwhile, carries its own bittersweet weight. He walks away from the story alive, with his music and his dreams still technically within reach, but he does so having lost nearly everything else that mattered to him, carrying forward memories and grief that will shape him for the rest of his life. The film does not pretend that walking away from violence is the same as walking away unscathed, and that refusal to soften the emotional cost of the story is a large part of why Juice has endured as such a respected and influential piece of filmmaking, rather than fading into the background as just another crime drama from its era. That is the complete story of Juice, from the easy friendship of four young men in Harlem to the devastating chain of events that tore them apart forever. It is a film that never asks you to look away from the consequences of violence, and it never lets its characters, or its audience, off the hook for the choices that were made along the way. If this retelling gave you a new appreciation for just how carefully constructed this story really is, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who needs to experience this film's power for themselves, and subscribe to Review and Facts so you do not miss the rest of our deep dive into Juice. Welcome back to Review and Facts. We have already given you the full overview of Juice and the complete story retelling, and now it is time to turn our attention to the people who actually brought this film to life. Juice is remembered today not just for its story but for the extraordinary group of performers who filled out its cast, several of whom were stepping in front of a camera for the very first time and went on to build entire careers off the strength of what they did in this one film. Today we are covering the life stories of the actors behind Q, Bishop, Raheem, Steele, and a few of the unforgettable supporting faces who gave Juice its texture and its cultural weight. This is a long one, so let's get into it properly, starting with the actor who played the emotional center of the entire film. Epps's journey into the LaGuardia High School of Music and Art and Performing Arts is itself worth dwelling on for a moment, because the school has produced an outsized share of major creative talents over the decades, and being accepted into its program at a young age signaled real, recognized ability rather than mere hobbyist enthusiasm. Epps has spoken over the years about how formative that environment was, surrounded by other driven, artistically serious teenagers who took their crafts seriously long before the wider world had any reason to notice them. That environment of disciplined ambition seems to have carried directly into how Epps approached his first major film role, treating a story about troubled Harlem youth not as an opportunity for a flashy debut but as a genuine acting challenge worth preparing for seriously, and critics at the time did note the grounded, unshowy quality of his performance as Q compared to the more combustible energy surrounding him on screen. Omar Epps was born on July 20, 1973, in Brooklyn, New York, and he grew up across several different Brooklyn neighborhoods, including Bedford-Stuyvesant, East New York, and East Flatbush, giving him first-hand exposure to exactly the kind of urban environment that Juice would eventually ask him to portray on screen. His parents divorced while he was still a child, and Epps was raised primarily by his mother, Bonnie Maria Epps, who worked as an elementary school principal. That household, led by an educator, seems to have shaped Omar's early creative instincts in a meaningful way, because by the age of 10 he was already writing poetry, songs, and short stories, showing an inclination toward artistic expression well before he ever set foot on a film set. His talent was serious enough that he was accepted into the Fiorello H. LaGuardia High School of Music and Art and Performing Arts, the same famously selective New York institution that inspired the movie and television series fame. While there, Epps became close friends with classmates Marlon and Sean Wayans, a friendship that would carry on for decades into their respective careers in Hollywood. Before acting fully took over his life, Epps was also involved in music, forming a rap group called Wolf Pack with his cousin in 1991, and he would return to music production and songwriting at various points throughout his career, even releasing his own album years later. It is also worth noting just how quickly Hollywood moved to typecast Epps in the immediate aftermath of Juice, repeatedly casting him in roles built around athletic prowess or troubled young manhood, a pattern common to many young black actors breaking into the industry during this era regardless of the range they had actually demonstrated. Epps has spoken candidly in later interviews about navigating that early period of his career, aware that the industry often wanted to place him into a narrow box shaped by his breakout role, even as he worked steadily to expand into more varied territory. His eventual move into long-running television work on ER and later House allowed him to demonstrate a different, more sustained kind of range than the string of film roles from the 1990s had allowed, playing complex, evolving characters across many seasons rather than single, tightly defined film roles. Epps's very first film role was Juice, cast as Quincy, known as Q, the quiet and thoughtful member of the friend group whose passion for DJing offers him a genuine way out of the cycle his friends are trapped in. He was a teenager himself when he took on the role, and the film's success helped launch him almost immediately into a series of high-profile parts. In the years directly following Juice, Epps found himself repeatedly cast as athletes and troubled young men, appearing in the program in 1993 as a college football player alongside James Caan and Halle Berry, then stepping into the world of baseball the following year in Major League Two, taking over the role of Willie Mays Hayes from Wesley Snipes. In 1995 he appeared in John Singleton's Higher Learning, playing a track and field athlete navigating the racial tensions of college life, a film that continued to build on the socially conscious, character-driven work he had begun with Juice. Epps also had a memorable early cameo in screen. Television eventually became just as important to Epps's career as film. From 1996 to 1997 he had a recurring role as Dr. Dennis Gant on the massively popular medical drama ER, and years later, in 2004, he was cast as Dr. Eric Foreman on the Fox series House, a role he held for 8 consecutive seasons until the show ended in 2012. Becoming one of the more recognizable faces on American television throughout that entire run. Along the way, Epps was cast in other notable films, including 1999's The Mod Squad and the beloved romantic drama Love and Basketball in 2000, which paired him again with actress Sanaa Lathan, whom he had previously worked with and dated. Personally, Epps married Keisha Spivey, a singer from the R&B group Total, in 2006, and the two shared 2 children together, a daughter and a son, in addition to a daughter Epps had from an earlier relationship. Beyond acting, Epps has continued to write, publishing a memoir called From Fatherless to Fatherhood as well as an Afrofuturist novel, extending his early love of storytelling into an entirely different medium later in life. Looking back at his career, it is genuinely remarkable how much of Omar Epps' foundation as an actor traces directly back to that first film role in Juice, a performance he delivered while barely out of his teenage years that still holds up as one of the more grounded and emotionally intelligent debuts of its era. Beyond his acting and writing pursuits, Epps has also remained connected to music throughout his adult life, releasing a full-length album titled Omar Epps Presents: The Get Back in 2004, which showcased his songwriting and production abilities outside the context of any film or television project. This continued investment in music reflects the same creative instincts that were present in him as a 10-year-old boy writing poetry and short stories, suggesting that acting, however central it became to his public identity, was always just one outlet among several for a broader creative drive that has stayed with him throughout his life. Over the course of his career, Epps has also received extensive industry recognition, including multiple NAACP Image Awards, a Screen Actors Guild Award. Now we come to the performance that, more than any other element of the film, has cemented Juice's place in cinema history, the debut of Tupac Amaru Shakur as Roland Bishop. Tupac was born on June 16, 1971, in New York City's Harlem neighborhood, a location that would later become the literal setting of the film that gave him his acting start. His mother, Afeni Shakur, born Alice Faye Williams in Lumberton, North Carolina, was a committed political activist and a member of the Black Panther Party, and at the time of Tupac's birth she had only recently been acquitted in a lengthy and highly publicized trial in which she and 20 other Black Panther members had been accused of conspiring to bomb New York City police stations and department stores. Afeni had been jailed while pregnant with Tupac and was released, still pregnant, after the acquittal, meaning that Tupac Shakur was born into a family already defined by activism, legal battles, and confrontation with the state before he had even taken his first breath. His biological father, Billy Garland, was also connected to the Black Panther movement, though Tupac had very little contact with him throughout his childhood and only came to know him properly as an adult. It is worth pausing here to consider just how unlikely Tupac's entire trajectory into film might have seemed at any earlier point in his young life. Here was someone who had spent his childhood constantly uprooted, moving from city to city as his family's circumstances shifted, someone who had watched both his mother and stepfather cycle in and out of legal jeopardy tied to their political activism, someone who by his own later accounts felt like an outsider in many of the environments he was placed in as a kid. Too sensitive and too artistically inclined for a world that often expected hardened toughness from young black men growing up the way he did. That sensitivity, channeled first into poetry and stage performance and later into music, became the raw material for one of the most compelling debut performances in the history of American film, and it is genuinely remarkable that a role written around themes of paranoia, betrayal, and the corrosive Tupac's childhood was defined by constant movement and considerable instability, as his family relocated repeatedly between New York, Baltimore, and eventually California, often driven by financial hardship, his mother's struggles, and the fallout of the political world his parents were entangled in. Despite this instability, or perhaps partly because of it, Tupac gravitated toward the arts from a young age, finding in performance and poetry a kind of refuge that the rest of his environment rarely offered him. His first taste of acting came in 1983 when he performed in a stage production of A Raisin in the Sun with Harlem's 127th Street Repertory Ensemble at the historic Apollo Theater, an early indication of a talent that would not fully reveal itself to the wider world for almost another decade. When his family moved to Baltimore, Tupac attended the Baltimore School for the Arts, where he studied poetry, jazz, acting, and ballet, developing a genuinely disciplined artistic foundation that often gets overlooked in favor of his later reputation as a rap icon. It was during this period that he also began building a serious relationship with hip-hop, eventually moving to California as a teenager, where he became involved with the alternative. Tupac's audition for Juice has become something of a legend in film history. According to accounts from those involved in the production, several other performers, including Treach, Money B, and Donald Faison, had auditioned for the role of Bishop, but none of them felt entirely right to the filmmakers. Tupac had actually accompanied his friend Money B to that audition, not originally intending to try out for the part himself, but he asked producer Neil Moritz for a chance to read, was given just 15 minutes to prepare, and delivered an audition strong enough to secure the role on the spot. It was a moment of pure instinct paying off in a way that would alter the entire trajectory of his life. Juice marked Tupac's first film role, and his performance as Bishop, a young man whose hunger for respect curdles into paranoia and violence, is now widely regarded as one of the most electrifying screen debuts in hip-hop cinema history. Critics at the time praised the raw, unpredictable energy he brought. Director Ernest Dickerson has spoken over the years about how quickly it became clear that Tupac's audition had settled the matter of who would play Bishop, describing a kind of raw, unteachable presence that no amount of coaching could have manufactured in a less naturally gifted performer. Several members of the Juice production team have similarly recalled that once Tupac stepped into the role, the character of Bishop seemed to take on a life of its own, shaped as much by Tupac's own instincts and personal history as by anything explicitly written on the page. This blending of performer and character is part of why the role continues to resonate so strongly decades later, because audiences watching Juice today cannot fully separate Bishop's fictional descent into violence and paranoia from the knowledge of how Tupac's own life would eventually end in real-world violence just a handful of years following Juice. Tupac continued to build an acting career alongside his rapidly rising music career, appearing in films such as Poetic Justice opposite Janet Jackson and later Above the Rim, while simultaneously releasing albums that would establish him as one of the most influential and commercially successful rap artists of his generation. His music explored themes of poverty, systemic injustice, police brutality, and the everyday realities of life in marginalized communities, subject matter that echoed much of what Juice itself had already explored on screen. It is also worth noting that Tupac's musical career was still in its earliest stages when Juice was released, meaning that many audiences who first encountered him through the film were meeting him as an actor before they ever came to know him as a recording artist in his own right. His debut solo album, Tupacalypse Now, arrived that same year, and the two sides of his public identity, the volatile screen performer and the increasingly prominent recording artist, developed almost in tandem over the following years, each amplifying awareness of the other. This dual rise helped cement Tupac's cultural significance in a way that few artists of any era have matched, becoming simultaneously one of hip-hop's most influential voices and one of its most compelling screen presences. Tragically, Tupac Shakur's life was cut short on September 13, 1996, 6 days after he was shot multiple times in a drive-by shooting while riding in a car in Las Vegas following a boxing match. He was only 25 years old. His death sent shockwaves through the music and film industries alike, and in the decades since, his case has remained the subject of extensive investigation, with an arrest finally made in the case in 2023. Even now, 30 years removed from Juice, Tupac's performance as Bishop continues to be studied and celebrated as the foundation of a legacy that reshaped how the world understood the intersection of hip-hop and cinema. Even within his own family, Tupac's relationship to performance and identity was complicated from the very start. His mother officially changed his name to Tupac Amaru Shakur when he was only a year old, a name drawn from Tupac Amaru II, an 18th-century indigenous leader who led a rebellion against Spanish colonial rule in Peru, a deliberate choice reflecting the revolutionary political consciousness that defined so much of his mother's own life and worldview. Growing up carrying a name with that kind of historical and political weight, in a household constantly shaped by activism, incarceration, and upheaval, gave Tupac an unusually early and direct education in themes of power, resistance, and injustice, themes that would eventually surface again and again throughout both his music and his approach to acting. Turning next to Khalil Kain, who played Raheem Porter, the most emotionally grounded and forward-looking member of the group. Kain was born on November 22, 1964, in Manhattan, New York City, making him somewhat older than his fellow cast members at the time Juice was filmed. His background is genuinely fascinating from a cultural standpoint, because his mother, June, is of African American and Chinese descent, and his father, Jyland Kain, is a respected poet, playwright, and recording artist who was a founding member of the Last Poets, a group widely credited as one of the direct precursors to hip-hop itself, blending spoken-word poetry with rhythm and political commentary in a way that predates and directly influenced the genre Tupac himself would later help define. Growing up with that kind of artistic lineage clearly shaped Khalil Kain's own sensibilities as a performer. He attended Hunter College High School in New York before his family relocated to California, where he completed his secondary education at Foothill High School, graduating in 1983. He later returned to New York and studied film at New York University, giving him a more formal, academically grounded introduction to the craft of filmmaking compared to some of his younger, less experienced castmates on Juice. It is worth emphasizing just how unusual Khalil Kain's background made him within the context of this particular cast. While his three younger castmates were essentially discovering the film industry for the first time through Juice itself, Kain arrived with a genuine academic grounding in filmmaking from his time at NYU, along with a family history steeped directly in the artistic and political movements that gave rise to hip-hop culture in the first place. His father's work with the Last Poets in the late 1960s and early 1970s is frequently cited by music historians as a direct precursor to rap as an art form, blending politically charged spoken-word poetry with percussive rhythm in a way that anticipated much of what would later define hip-hop vocal delivery. Growing up around that lineage gave Khalil Kain a distinctive vantage point on the material Juice was exploring, and several observers of the production have noted that his slightly more mature, world-weary approach to playing Raheem helped ground the character as the group's most reluctant participant in Bishop's escalating recklessness. Kain was 27 years old when Juice was released, and his performance as Raheem, a young man caught between the freedom of adolescence and the looming responsibility of impending fatherhood, gave the film one of its most human and relatable emotional threads. Following Juice, Kain continued to build a respectable and varied career across film and television. In 1994 he appeared in the comedy-drama Renaissance Man alongside Danny DeVito and Gregory Hines, and in 1997 he took on a leading role in the acclaimed romantic drama Love Jones, alongside Lawrence Tate and Nia Long, a film that remains beloved for its portrayal of black romance and creative life in Chicago. Kain also portrayed golfer Tiger Woods in a Showtime television film called The Tiger Woods Story, and in 2001 he reunited with Juice director Ernest Dickerson for the horror film Bones, which starred Snoop Dogg. Perhaps his most enduring role after Juice came on television, where from 2001 to 2008 he played Darnell Wilkes, husband to the character Maya, on the UPN and later CW's sitcom Girlfriends, a role he took over from actor Flex Alexander, who had coincidentally also appeared in Juice in a smaller capacity. Kain's television resume grew to include guest appearances on shows such as Friends, Living Single, Moesha, Sister Sister, Suddenly Susan, Blue Bloods, and Elementary, reflecting a long and steady career built on consistent, reliable work across many different corners of the industry. Beyond acting, Kain has trained extensively in martial arts and holds a black belt in the Korean discipline of Hapkido, and in more recent years he has moved into directing and producing as well, including work on projects screened at hip-hop-focused film festivals. He is married to Elise, unlike some of his castmates, whose paths after Juice led toward blockbuster visibility. Khalil Kain has built what might be described as one of the steadiest and most quietly sustained careers to emerge from the film, moving fluidly between film, television, and eventually behind the camera work as a director and producer, without ever fully stepping away from the industry that Juice first opened up for him. His decades-long presence on shows ranging from Girlfriends to Blue Bloods to Elementary reflects the kind of durable, dependable career that many working actors aspire to but relatively few achieve, built on consistent professionalism rather than a single defining blockbuster moment. Rounding out the core group of four friends is Jermaine Hopkins, often credited affectionately as Huggy, who played Eric Thurman, known as Steele, the easygoing, loyalty-driven member of the group who spends much of the film trying to keep the peace between his friends. Hopkins was born on August 23, 1973, in Newark, New Jersey, and his path into acting began almost by chance when he was just 14 years old. His mother brought him to an open casting call audition in New York City for the Warner Brothers feature film Lean on Me, a decision that would end up shaping the entire course of his life. Hopkins landed a starring role in that film as Thomas Sams, a misguided, drug-involved junior high school student, appearing opposite the legendary Morgan Freeman, who played the real-life inspired Principal Joe Clark. There is something particularly striking about the fact that Jermaine Hopkins landed a starring role opposite Morgan Freeman in his very first audition, at only 14 years old, without any prior acting training or experience to draw on. That kind of early success can just as easily derail a young performer's development as launch it, yet Hopkins managed to parlay that first opportunity directly into a second, even more culturally significant role in Juice barely a few years later, suggesting a natural instinct for performance that industry professionals recognized early and Juice became Hopkins's very next major project after Lean on Me, and his performance as Steele gave the friend group its emotional glue, the character whose humor and warmth make the eventual disintegration of the group's bond feel all the more devastating. Following Juice, Hopkins continued working steadily through the 1990s, appearing in the made-for-television drama Murder Without Motive, the Edmund Perry story in 1992, which was based on a real-life tragedy involving a young black teenager, and later appearing in the family comedy The Little Rascals in 1994. He starred in the HBO film Strapped, which marked the directorial debut of actor Forest Whitaker, and in 1996 he carried his own leading film for the first time in the comedy Fat Beach, playing a character named Benny King from beginning to end. That same period saw him land a recurring television role as Dupree on the sitcom The Wayans Brothers, appearing in 10 episodes across multiple seasons, a role that reconnected him professionally with the same Wayans family that Omar Epps had befriended back in high school. In 1997, Hopkins appeared in Def Jam's How to Be a Player, playing a character named Kilo alongside Bill Bellamy. His career continued well into later decades with guest appearances on shows including Law and Order, Special Victims Unit, Zoo, Elementary, and Blue Bloods, and he has remained an active working actor in film and television projects released as recently as the past few years. Hopkins stands 5 feet 6 inches tall, and throughout his career he has continued to be closely associated with the nickname Huggy, a piece of his identity that has followed him affectionately since his very earliest days in the industry. Hopkins's early career also unfolded during a period when Hollywood was actively searching for authentic young black voices to anchor stories about inner-city youth culture, and his particular gift for blending comedic warmth with genuine emotional vulnerability made him a natural fit for roles that required more than just toughness or bravado. Where Bishop's arc in Juice depends on the audience believing in his descent into menace, Steele's arc depends almost entirely on the audience believing in his loyalty and his fear, and Hopkins brought exactly the kind of open, expressive presence needed to make those emotions land clearly on screen, particularly in the film's later, more harrowing sequences. Hopkins's career trajectory following his early breakthroughs is a useful reminder that not every actor from a landmark film needs to become a household name in order to sustain a genuinely long and productive career. Rather than chasing a single defining blockbuster moment the way some of his peers did, Hopkins settled into a pattern of consistent, varied work across film and television that has kept him steadily employed for well over 3 decades, a form of longevity in the entertainment industry that deserves just as much recognition as the more headline-grabbing kind of start. While Q, Bishop, Raheem, and Steele form the emotional core of Juice, the film is also remembered for a handful of supporting performances from actors who would go on to become some of the most famous names in entertainment history, and no discussion of the cast would be complete without covering them as well. Samuel L. Jackson, who plays a supporting role as a character named Trip, was already an experienced actor by the time Juice was released, though his true breakthrough into global stardom was still a couple of years away. Jackson was born on December 21, 1948, in Washington, D.C., and grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee, during a period defined by the racial dynamics of the segregated American South. He attended Morehouse College in Atlanta, originally intending to study marine biology before discovering a passion for theater that redirected the entire course of his education and eventually his career. After graduating, Jackson spent years building his craft on stage and in smaller screen roles, and it was his collaboration with director Spike Lee that gave him his first significant exposure, appearing in School Days, Do the Right Thing, Mo Better Blues, and most importantly, Jungle Fever in 1991, in which his portrayal of a drug-addicted character earned him a specially created Best Supporting Actor award at the Cannes Film Festival, an extraordinary recognition that Jackson has said helped him confront his own struggles with substance abuse at the time. Juice arrived in the midst of this rising period for Jackson, appearing alongside other early 90s roles in films like Patriot Games. It would not be until 1994, 2 years after Juice, that Jackson would deliver the performance that made him a household name worldwide, playing the philosophical hitman Jules Winfield in Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction, a role that earned him his only Academy Award nomination to date and set him on a path to becoming, by some measures, the highest-grossing actor in. Jackson's road to Juice was itself shaped by considerable personal struggle. In interviews given later in his career, he has spoken candidly about battling substance abuse during the years leading up to his breakthrough performance in Jungle Fever, describing the process of confronting that addiction as directly tied to the emotional honesty he was able to bring to that role and the roles that followed it, including his supporting turn in Juice. That willingness to draw on real personal history in service of his performances became something of a hallmark of Jackson's approach to acting. Jackson's own account of his early career often emphasizes just how long he had to wait for his breakthrough compared to the relatively fast rise of some of his younger Juice castmates, having spent well over a decade working in theater and smaller film roles before Pulp Fiction finally made him a household name at the age of 46. That patience, and the discipline it required, has become a defining part of how Jackson is remembered within the industry, a reminder that lasting stardom does not always arrive on a predictable early timeline, and that steady, committed craftsmanship across many years of less visible work can eventually pay off in extraordinary fashion. Also appearing in Juice in a memorable cameo is Queen Latifah, portraying a character known as the Roughhouse MC. Born Dana Elaine Owens on March 18, 1970, in Newark, New Jersey, Queen Latifah had already established herself as a significant force in hip-hop by the time Juice was released. Having signed with Tommy Boy Records at the age of 18 after a demo tape she recorded with a local New Jersey DJ caught the label's attention. Her debut album, All Hail the Queen, released in 1989, blended soul, reggae, and dance influences with feminist, socially conscious lyrics that immediately set her apart within a genre that was overwhelmingly male-dominated at the time. She had made her own film acting debut the year before Juice, appearing in Spike Lee's Jungle Fever in 1991, the very same film that had helped launch Samuel L. Jackson towards stardom, making Juice something of a reunion for two performers who had briefly crossed paths in that earlier production. In the years following Juice, Queen Latifah's career expanded dramatically across music, film, and television, including a lead role on the sitcom Living Single, a Grammy win in 1995 for her socially charged single Unity, and eventually an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress for her role in the 2002 musical Chicago, making her the first female rapper ever nominated for an Oscar. Her presence in Juice, brief as it is, reflects just how deeply embedded the film was within the actual hip-hop culture of its moment, casting real musical artists and it is also worth noting that Queen Latifah's involvement in Juice arrived during a genuinely turbulent stretch of her personal life, only months before the sudden death of her older brother Lance, a police officer who died in a motorcycle accident on a bike she had given him as a gift, a loss that sent her into a period of deep grief that she has spoken about candidly in later interviews. Despite that hardship, her career continued to accelerate through the early 1990s, and her brief but memorable appearance in Juice stands as one of many small but meaningful credits from this transitional period of her professional life, sitting right at the intersection of her rise as a recording artist and her gradual expansion into a much larger. Queen Latifah's presence within Juice also connects to a wider constellation of real hip-hop figures who appeared in small cameo roles throughout the film, including artists like Fab Five Freddy, Ed Lover, EPMD, and Special Ed, each of whom brought genuine credibility from within the culture the film was portraying. This casting choice reflects a deliberate approach on the part of director Ernest Dickerson, blending trained actors with recognizable figures from the actual hip-hop scene of the early 1990s in order to ground the film's depiction of Harlem youth culture in something closer to lived authenticity than a purely fictionalized recreation could have achieved on its own. Taken together, the cast of Juice represents an extraordinary convergence of talent at very different stages of their respective careers, from teenagers making their very first appearance on camera to established musicians stepping into film roles to veteran character actors on the verge of much greater fame. Omar Epps and Jermaine Hopkins were still teenagers finding their footing in an industry that would go on to define much of their adult lives. Khalil Kain brought a slightly more seasoned, formally trained presence shaped by a genuinely remarkable artistic family background. Tupac Shakur delivered a performance that would forever be remembered as one of the great screen debuts in American film history, cut tragically short only a few years later. And supporting figures like Samuel L. Jackson and Queen Latifah added texture and credibility to a film that has only grown in stature and cultural significance in the decades since its release. Very few films can claim a cast this loaded with future icons captured at the very beginning of their respective journey. That brings us to the end of our deep dive into the cast of Juice. If you learned something new about the incredible group of performers who brought this story to life, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who appreciates great film history, and subscribe to Review and Facts so you never miss. To understand the making of Juice, you first have to understand just how long this project sat around before anyone was willing to make it. Ernest Dickerson and his writing partner Gerard Brown first developed the idea back in the early 1980s, not long after Dickerson had finished film school at New York University. The two men had known each other since their college days and had always talked about eventually collaborating on a project they could call their own. Dickerson wanted to make something closer to a film noir, except with teenage characters at the center of it instead of adults, and the two of them spent time hashing out the earliest version of what would eventually become Juice. According to Brown, the entire premise began with a late-night phone call from Dickerson, who had only a handful of scene ideas fully formed in his head at the time but enough conviction to get Brown out of bed to start writing them down. That early draft became the foundation of the film, and Brown has said it was the very first screenplay he ever completed in his career. Unfortunately, having a finished script did not mean anyone in Hollywood was interested in making it. For years, Juice sat completely dormant, rejected again and again by executives who felt the material was simply too dark and too honest for mainstream audiences to embrace. Dickerson has recalled being told at various points that the story needed to be softened, that it should lean harder into comedy, and that the darker elements of the plot needed to be smoothed over into something closer to a light-hearted romp about mischievous kids getting into trouble in Harlem. Both Dickerson and Brown flatly refused to make those changes, understanding that watering down the story would undercut the entire point of what they were trying to say about peer pressure, respect, and the consequences of chasing power through violence. That refusal to compromise meant the script continued to sit unused for nearly a decade while Dickerson built an entirely. It is worth pausing here to appreciate just how unusual it was for a major studio like Paramount to eventually distribute a film that had been developed almost entirely outside the traditional studio system. Juice was financed independently through Island World and only picked up by Paramount for distribution once the film was substantially complete, meaning the creative decisions that shaped the movie, from casting to tone to the raw, unpolished energy of its Harlem locations, were made largely without the kind of heavy studio oversight that typically governs a major theatrical release. That independence gave Dickerson and Brown far more creative freedom than they likely would have had if a studio had been involved from the very beginning. It was not until the very end of the 1980s that circumstances finally aligned to get Juice moving again. Dickerson's reputation as a cinematographer had grown enormously by this point, largely due to his work behind the camera on some of Spike Lee's most acclaimed early films, and that reputation opened doors that had previously been firmly shut. Around the same time, Gerard Brown had a play running in Los Angeles that caught the attention of a West Coast literary agent, who asked to see everything he had ever written. Among the material Brown sent over was the long-dormant Juice script, and it eventually found its way to a small group of producers who were actively looking for exactly the kind of gritty, music-driven, urban story that Juice represented. The financial structure behind Juice also reflected the broader gamble that low-budget urban dramas represented for Hollywood at the start of the 1990s. Films exploring similar territory, stories rooted in black communities and told with a level of grit and honesty rarely afforded major studio budgets, were only just beginning to prove their commercial viability around the same period, and financiers backing Juice were taking a real risk on material that had already been rejected by more cautious executives for the better part of a decade. That risk paid off in a way that few could have confidently predicted at the time, and the eventual success of Juice became part of a broader wave of films that helped convince the industry there was a substantial and enthusiastic. From there, the project moved into the hands of financiers connected to Island World, the company associated with music industry figure Chris Blackwell, who had built his reputation primarily through his work in the record business before branching out into film financing. Backing from Island World gave Juice the green light it had been denied for years, though the budget attached to the project was famously modest, reported by those closest to the production at somewhere around $3 million. though some official studio records list the figure closer to $5 million once all costs were finalized. Either way, by Hollywood standards, particularly for a film eventually distributed by a major studio like Paramount Pictures, Juice was an extremely lean, low-budget production, made on a fraction of what a typical studio film of that era might have cost. What makes that budget figure so remarkable in hindsight is just how far it stretched. Juice went on to earn just over $20 million at the worldwide box office, meaning the film returned somewhere between 4 and 6 times its original production cost. The tight budget also shaped many of the day-to-day practical decisions made throughout production, from the relatively compact shooting schedule to the heavy reliance on real Harlem locations rather than expensive constructed sets. Filming largely on location meant the production had to work quickly and efficiently, blocking off streets for limited windows of time and adapting to the unpredictable realities of shooting in a living, breathing neighborhood rather than a fully controlled studio environment. This scrappy, resourceful approach to filmmaking ended up becoming one of the film's greatest creative strengths rather than a limitation, giving Juice a visual and atmospheric. Even after securing financing, the path to actually making Juice was not simple, and one of the biggest challenges facing the production was finding the right actors to fill out its 4 central roles. Dickerson and his casting team made a deliberate decision early on to avoid established young television stars, feeling strongly that recognizable faces from sitcoms and family dramas would undercut the sense of raw authenticity the story demanded. Instead, the casting director combed through performing arts high schools and community theater programs across New York City, auditioning literally hundreds of young hopefuls in search of 4 actors who could believably feel like lifelong friends who had grown up together on the same block. It was an unusually demanding casting process, because the filmmakers were not simply looking for 4. There is a particularly amusing wrinkle to the story of how the 4 leads were ultimately paired together, because the filmmakers were not simply auditioning actors individually for predetermined roles. They were experimenting with different combinations of young performers together in the room, watching how various groupings interacted with one another before deciding which 4 personalities actually clicked as a believable unit. Several different configurations of actors were reportedly tried out together during this process, with casting staff quietly observing body language, banter, and chemistry the way a coach might evaluate potential teammates rather than simply judging individual line readings in isolation. It was only once Epps, Kain, Hopkins, and Shakur. Omar Epps was one of the earliest pieces to fall into place, and Dickerson has said he had a strong sense fairly early in the process that Epps was right for the role of Q. Khalil Kain, meanwhile, was originally viewed by many involved in the casting process as a strong contender for the role of Q as well, given his natural, grounded presence. And it actually came down to a close decision between Kain and Epps before the filmmakers ultimately decided to cast Kain as Raheem instead, a decision that famously was kept secret from Kain for a nerve-wracking stretch during his own final audition, when he briefly believed he had been cut from the film entirely before being pulled aside and told the good news. Jermaine Hopkins, despite the character of Steele originally being written as a smaller, skinnier kid on the page, impressed the filmmakers so much with his. The casting of Bishop turned out to be the single most difficult puzzle of the entire process, and it is genuinely fascinating, looking back now, how close the production came to never finding Tupac Shakur at all. The filmmakers originally hoped to cast real rappers in all 4 lead roles, believing that authentic hip-hop performers would bring a level of credibility to the material that trained actors simply could not replicate. Dozens of rappers came through to audition, and while several had undeniable presence and charisma as musicians, almost none of them could actually deliver a convincing dramatic performance when the cameras started rolling. Tupac's involvement in the process happened almost by accident. He had accompanied a friend to the audition, not originally intending to read for the role himself, and it was only because another rapper auditioning that day, Naughty by Nature's Treach, turned to Tupac in the waiting room and casually asked if he wanted to give it a shot that Tupac ended up walking into the room at all. What followed inside that audition room became one of the most talked about moments in the film's entire production history, with Treach later recalling that the intensity coming from behind, adding to the humor of that entire audition saga. Tupac reportedly did not hold back at all once he realized he had genuinely impressed the room, immediately and confidently predicting to his fellow young hopefuls that he was destined for enormous success within the following year, going so far as to specifically declare that he expected to be a millionaire soon thanks to his upcoming music career. According to those present, most of the other young actors in the room reacted with good-natured disbelief, teasing him for the bold claim rather than taking it entirely seriously, unaware at the time just how quickly and dramatically that particular prediction would end up coming true. Looking back now, knowing everything that followed in Tupac, once the four leads were locked in, the filmmakers made a deliberate effort to build real chemistry among Epps, Hopkins, Kain, and Shakur before shooting ever began, arranging time for them to spend together outside of any formal rehearsal setting so that the bond audiences would eventually see on screen felt genuine rather than manufactured. This turned out to be an enormously successful strategy, because the four young actors did, in fact, form a real and lasting friendship during the making of the film, spending huge amounts of time together both on and off set throughout the entire shoot. Given that these were largely teenagers suddenly thrust into a real professional film production, with blocked-off streets in Harlem, catered trailers, and a genuine sense of importance surrounding the project, it is not hard to understand why the atmosphere on set often swung wildly between serious, focused filmmaking and pure, unfiltered teenage chaos. And it is that chaos that cast and crew alike have also pointed to just how strange it felt, in retrospect, being teenagers suddenly thrust into a world of trailers, catering, blocked-off city streets, and a small army of crew members catering to their every professional need. For young actors who had grown up in ordinary working-class households in Brooklyn, Newark, and across New York City, the sudden shift into this kind of treatment produced a near-constant sense of disbelief throughout the shoot, with several cast members later admitting that their primary concern most days had far less to do with the artistic significance of the project, and far more to do with simply wrapping filming quickly enough to go enjoy the city together once the cameras stopped rolling. For the day. That light-hearted, almost carefree attitude toward what would eventually become a genuinely important piece of America. One of the most frequently retold stories from the set involves a scene in which the four friends are simply walking down a Harlem street together after skipping school, filmed in a continuous walking shot with a boom microphone held closely overhead to capture their dialogue. During one of the earliest warm days of the shoot, a production assistant working nearby had removed her heavier jacket for the first time, and the four young actors, entirely unaware that the overhead microphone was still live and recording every word, began loudly and enthusiastically commenting on her appearance as they walked. It was only after the director called cut and the crew burst into laughter that the actors realized their entire commentary had been captured clearly on tape. The rhythm of a typical shooting day also produced its own steady stream of lighter moments, simply through the ordinary friction of four strong personalities spending long hours together on set. Waiting between takes, sitting through lighting setups, and killing time in between scenes gave the young cast plenty of opportunity to entertain themselves and each other, whether through freestyle rap battles, ongoing trash talk about who had the sharper wit, or simple, unstructured horseplay that occasionally had to be gently reined in by crew members trying to keep the production on schedule. Tupac in particular was known to spend downtime scribbling in a rhyme notebook, often trading verses back and forth with naughty by nature's Treach, the two of them swapping notebooks and critiquing age differences and general teenage mischief provided plenty of additional comedy throughout the shoot as well. Jermaine Hopkins, the youngest member of the core group at the time, has recalled being treated very much like the little brother of the cast, a dynamic that occasionally got him into good-natured trouble. On one outing in Manhattan, Hopkins, only 17 at the time, attempted to order a beer at a bar the group had gone to, an attempt that did not sit well with Tupac, who was quick to scold him for trying to order alcohol he clearly had no business ordering at that age. It became something of a running joke throughout the production, the group's oldest and most streetwise member constantly having to look out for its youngest, even as that same youngest member was simultaneously navigating the surreal experience of being catered to, chauffeured around, and treated like a rising star for the very first time in his young life. The energy on set during off-camera moments could also get genuinely rowdy, particularly during club and party scenes that involved hundreds of background extras crowded into a single location. Cast members have described a lively, sometimes downright wild atmosphere during these sequences, with Tupac in particular bringing an outsized, larger-than-life energy to any room he walked into, cracking jokes and playfully needling his castmates in ways that kept everyone entertained between takes. Kain and Tupac especially developed a teasing, brotherly rapport built partly around their age difference, with Tupac occasionally reminding Kain, only half joking, that Kain was not in a position to boss him around despite being a few years older. At the same time, Tupac showed a clear soft spot for Hopkins underneath all the ribbing, and that mixture of genuine. One of the more amusing behind-the-scenes details involves a small but memorable moment in the film where Hopkins's character, Steele, casually pours beer into a bowl of eggs while cooking breakfast during a scene of the friends hanging out at his apartment. Hopkins himself has said he personally would never have actually eaten anything prepared that way in real life, but the choice made sense for the character in the context of the story. What nobody involved in the production anticipated was just how much that small, throwaway detail would resonate with audiences after the film's release, with viewers reportedly taking up the exact same habit of mixing beer into their eggs simply because they had seen it done in juice, turning one improvised bit of character business into an unexpected and slightly bizarre little pop culture trend. Omar Epps has also shared a particularly personal and light-hearted memory from this stretch of the shoot, recalling how he found himself genuinely starstruck watching singer Cindy Herron, who plays Q's love interest Yolanda in the film, appear on television with her group En Vogue during the production, only to end up filming romantic scenes alongside her in person just a short time afterward. His younger castmates, particularly Hopkins, have admitted to being more than a little envious of that arrangement, teasing Epps relentlessly about it throughout the shoot, while also pressing him privately for every detail once cameras stopped rolling for the day. Kain, too, has jokingly admitted to a fair amount of beyond the on-set antics. Several genuinely funny and occasionally surreal moments emerged from the production's efforts to weave real hip-hop culture directly into the fabric of the film. Because Dickerson and the producers wanted the movie to feel authentically connected to the actual New York hip-hop scene of the moment, they brought in a wide range of real musicians and personalities for cameo appearances, often without giving the young lead actors any advance warning about who exactly would be showing up on set on a given day. Cast members have described the surreal experience of simply arriving on location and discovering that established hip-hop duo EPMD was there filming a scene, or that Samuel L. Jackson, already a respected working actor at the time, was quietly present on set, or that Fab Five Freddy or Queen Latifah had shown up to shoot their small roles before sticking around afterward to hang out casually with the rest of the cast and crew. For a group of young actors who were themselves deeply immersed in hip-hop culture as fans long before they were ever cast in the film, encountering these figures in person, often with little to no fanfare, created a steady stream of genuinely thrilling and occasionally starstruck moments scattered throughout the production schedule. The film's soundtrack production created its own share of amusing behind-the-scenes stories as well. Legendary producers David Heyman and Peter Frankfurt, along with the rest of the production team, had gone after Public Enemy's celebrated production unit, the Bomb Squad, to handle the film's score, and Bomb Squad member Hank Shockily ended up deeply involved in shaping not just the film's music but also which artists would appear on its soundtrack. One particularly memorable anecdote involves the pursuit of the legendary rapper Raheem, who was expected to appear in a bar scene alongside EPMD but never actually showed up to set. When producers went looking for him at his apartment to figure out what had happened, the woman who answered the door was reportedly just as frustrated and confused about Raheem's whereabouts as the crew was, leaving everyone involved amused and mildly exasperated by the entire mix-up. Despite missing his scheduled appearance in the film itself, Raheem eventually more than made up for the absence, later delivering the soundtrack's title track after attending a screening of the finished film and reportedly offering only a brief, understated promise beforehand that he intended to do something special with the assignment, a promise he fully delivered on once the track was completed. The soundtrack itself became something of a happy accident in terms of how loaded it ended up being with major talent, featuring artists like Raheem, Big Daddy Kane, Naughty by Nature, and Cypress Hill, several of whom were still relatively unknown or underappreciated by their own record labels at the time. Cypress Hill, in particular, was reportedly on shaky ground with their label when shockily fought to get their music included in the film, and the exposure the group received through Juice is widely credited with playing a meaningful role in boosting their career trajectory shortly afterward. Naughty by Nature's contribution to the soundtrack came directly from Treach's insider knowledge of the film's plot, having read the script during his own audition process, allowing him to write lyrics that directly referenced specific moments from the story itself, including a line alluding to the pivotal scene in which Bishop shoots Raheem near a row of trash cans. Not everything that happened during the making of Juice was lighthearted, however, and the production also dealt with some genuinely tense and even dangerous moments while filming on location in Harlem. Because the production was shooting real scenes on real New York City streets, cast and crew occasionally found themselves confronted with the unpredictable realities of the neighborhood around them, completely unrelated to anything scripted for the film itself. Omar Epps has recalled an unsettling moment on the very first day of shooting, when the production encountered the aftermath of an actual, unrelated shooting death near their filming location, a stark reminder that the fictional dangers depicted in Juice existed uncomfortably close to real dangers present in the world the production was working within. On another occasion, a physical altercation broke out on set after a group of local kids attempted to steal items directly from Tupac's trailer, resulting in a genuinely serious confrontation on set that briefly took cast and crew by surprise, catching at least one castmate completely off guard because he initially assumed the commotion was simply another part of the film being shot nearby rather than a real altercation playing out in front of him. Given moments like these, the production ultimately brought in additional security for the remainder of the shoot, a decision that some crew members felt was blown. The filming of some of the movie's most emotionally intense scenes also produced memorable, if considerably more serious, behind-the-scenes moments. Actors have described how difficult it was, even in a purely fictional context, to film the sequence in which Bishop turns his gun on Raheem, with Tupac reportedly struggling during the first attempt to fully commit to the emotional weight of the moment. According to Khalil Kain, it was only after he pushed his own performance harder during a subsequent take, physically throwing himself into a stack of garbage cans during the confrontation, that Tupac fully locked into the intensity the scene required, leading to the take that ultimately made it into the finished film. Similarly, an unscripted moment developed during the aftermath of the robbery scene, when Tupac, entirely on his own initiative and without any direction calling for it, reached over and wiped away tears from Hopkins's face during a moment of raw emotional distress between their characters. A small but powerful piece of improvised physical acting that Hopkins has said elevated the entire scene and that neither he nor the filmmakers had planned for in advance. Behind-the-scenes tension also emerged around certain creative decisions imposed by the studio, particularly regarding the film's ending. According to Gerard Brown, the original version of the script called for Bishop to fall to his death from a rooftop after deliberately breaking free from Q's grip rather than face arrest, a choice meant to underscore just how completely consumed Bishop had become by his refusal to accept any form of defeat or captivity. Paramount reportedly pushed back hard against this version of the ending during test screenings, concerned that audiences were responding negatively to the idea that Bishop consciously chose his own death, seeing it as giving the character an almost heroic degree of control over his own fate. The filmmakers ultimately revised the sequence so that Bishop's fall reads as more of an accident, his grip simply slipping away rather than being deliberately released, a change that Brown has said he was never entirely satisfied with, even though he acknowledged it was a necessary compromise required to keep the studio's support behind the film's release. Once filming wrapped, the marketing and release of Juice produced its own small collection of memorable behind-the-scenes stories. The film's now iconic promotional poster, featuring Tupac holding a handgun close against his chest, became a point of significant controversy before release, with concerns raised about how the image might be perceived given ongoing anxieties at the time surrounding depictions of urban youth and violence in marketing materials for films like Boys and the Hood, which had experienced isolated incidents of violence at some theaters during its own opening weekend. Ultimately, the studio required the gun to be removed from the promotional artwork entirely, a decision Dickerson has said frustrated him considerably, given that the weapon functioned as such a central symbolic element within the story itself, essentially functioning as a character in its own right responsible for driving nearly every major turning point in the plot. The film's opening weekend brought its own mixture of excitement and chaos for those involved. Producer Peter Frankfurt has recalled receiving an early morning phone call informing him that the film had already tripled its production budget within its very first weekend in theaters, a genuinely stunning result for a project that had been made on such a modest budget and had spent years struggling to get off the ground in the first place. Ernest Dickerson, meanwhile, was overseas at the time of the film's release, working as a cinematographer on Malcolm X, and had to track the film's opening weekend performance from a distance, receiving updates about its box office numbers while working on an entirely different project thousands of miles away. Khalil Kain, for his part, experienced a sudden shift in his own public recognition almost immediately, describing an overwhelming and slightly alarming moment shortly after the film's release when he found himself surrounded and mobbed by excited fans on a New York City subway platform, a jarring introduction to a level of public attention that none of the young cast members had previously experienced in their lives. In the years and decades that followed its release, Juice steadily grew from a modestly reviewed theatrical release into a genuine cult classic, continuing to find new audiences well beyond its original theatrical run. Gerard Brown has compared the intensity of audience engagement with the film to the kind of dedicated, ritualistic fandom typically associated with midnight cult screenings, describing crowds who know entire stretches of dialogue by heart. Dickerson himself has said he was genuinely surprised, years later, to learn that his own daughter and her friends had taken to hosting informal viewing gatherings built entirely around watching Juice together, treating the film with the kind of reverence typically reserved for far more prestigious or widely celebrated releases. Cast members have shared similarly unexpected stories of the film's lasting cultural footprint, including an account from Hopkins describing an encounter years later with a major contemporary rap artist who, upon recognizing him, immediately and enthusiastically praised the film as something he had watched on an almost daily basis growing up. Looking back across the entire journey of Juice, from a script that sat rejected and unwanted for nearly a decade, to a modestly budgeted production that leaned heavily on unknown young talent and genuine hip-hop authenticity, to a film that would eventually become one of the defining cultural artifacts of early 90s black cinema. It is remarkable just how much of what makes the film special grew directly out of circumstances nobody fully planned for. The chemistry between its four young leads was cultivated deliberately, but the specific, spontaneous moments of friendship, mischief, and creative improvisation that resulted from that chemistry could never have been scripted in advance. The soundtrack came together through a combination of genuine industry relationships and sheer creative persistence. And the film's now legendary lead performance from Tupac Shakur happened almost by complete accident, the direct result of one rapper turning to a friend in a waiting room and casually suggesting he give the audition a try. Few films in cinema history have been shaped so heavily by a mixture of genuine artistic conviction, low-budget resourcefulness, and pure serendipitous chance, and that unlikely combination is a huge part of why Juice continues to be studied, celebrated, and rewatched more than 3 decades after it first made its way into theaters. That brings us to the end of our deep dive into the making of Juice, the budget behind it, and the wild, funny, and occasionally chaotic stories from behind the scenes. If you enjoyed getting an inside look at how this film actually came together, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who loves a great behind-the-scenes story, and subscribe to Review and Facts so you never miss the rest of our coverage on this unforgettable film.